You're standing at the edge of a ruined villa on the outskirts of Rome. The dawn of June 9th, 68 AD breaks through a pale mist, carrying with it the smell of decay and fear. Inside, behind warped wooden doors, the ruler of the Roman Empire trembles. Once the master of armies, the scourge of his own people, Nero now mutters in despair, his voice no longer the commanding tone of an emperor, but the broken cries of a desperate man. This is how the story of Nero Claudius Caesar ends, a man who ordered the death of his own mother, who crushed his pregnant wife with a kick, who forced a boy to live as her replacement, and who sang of ancient Troy as flames consumed his capital. Yet here he is, not on the battlefield, not surrounded by loyal soldiers, but hiding in the home of a freedman, unable even to take his own life without help. But to understand why the most powerful man in the ancient world died like a frightened child, we must step back to the poisoned corridors of Roman politics, where ambition, betrayal, and blood shaped the boy who would become a monster. December 37 AD, in the coastal town of Antium, a child named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born. His lineage was soaked in violence long before his first breath. His ancestors paraded severed heads as trophies, gouged out the eyes of rivals in public squares, and boasted of cruelty as if it were honor. Even his own father, known for his brutality, admitted that nothing good could come from his union with Agrippina. Agrippina the Younger, sister to Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus, was as ambitious as she was dangerous. She had been exiled for conspiracy, suspected of poisoning her husband, and carried within her a single obsession: to see her son on the throne of Rome. By the time Lucius was 3 years old, his father was dead. Whispers of poison followed his burial, though others claimed disease. Whatever the truth, the boy's path was already being carved by blood and ambition. The boy should have inherited a fortune, but fate had other plans. A third of his father's estate vanished the moment Caligula confiscated the family's wealth. His mother, Agrippina, was exiled to a barren rock in the sea, leaving the child to be raised by an aunt with little more than 2 servants, a barber and a dancer. Scarcely the upbringing of an emperor, but Agrippina was never one to accept defeat. When Caligula was struck down in 41 AD, and her uncle Claudius stumbled into power, she clawed her way back into Rome's inner circle. First, she married a wealthy noble, Gaius Passienus Crispus, who died suspiciously soon after, leaving her his fortune. Then she aimed higher, the emperor himself. Claudius already had a wife, Messalina, infamous for her reckless lusts. But when Messalina staged a mock wedding with her lover, she sealed her own fate. Claudius ordered her execution, and Agrippina swooped in. Picture the scene: an aging, stammering emperor utterly bewitched by his beautiful, ambitious niece. Roman law forbade such a union, but emperors bent the law as they pleased. In 49 AD, 12-year-old Lucius watched his mother crowned empress. Claudius adopted the boy, giving him a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar. By 13, he wore the toga of manhood. At 14, he was declared heir over Claudius's own son, Britannicus. At 15, he was married to Octavia, Claudius's daughter, tying him directly into the imperial bloodline. But Agrippina's hunger for power could not wait. In October 54 AD, Claudius ate a dish of his favorite food, mushrooms, and never rose again. Rome whispered of poison, of a hired hand forcing a feather dipped in toxins down the emperor's throat. Whether true or not, one fact was undeniable: Claudius died in torment, and Nero, at just 17, ascended the throne. At first, Rome dared to hope. The young emperor spoke of mercy and humility. He reduced taxes, gave gifts to the people, and when handed his first death warrant, he sighed, "If only I did not know how to write." For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Augustus's golden age might return. But the illusion of a merciful ruler didn't last long. Those closest to Nero could already see the cracks. His teacher, Seneca, later admitted he felt as though he had raised another Caligula, and he was right. Behind the mask of generosity, Nero was plotting his first murder. The victim was his stepbrother, Britannicus. Barely 14, quiet and uninterested in power, yet his bloodline made him dangerous. At a palace banquet, surrounded by Rome's elite, the boy asked for his wine to be cooled. The water had been poisoned. Before the guests could react, Britannicus collapsed, gasping and convulsing on the floor. Foam spilled from his mouth as his body twisted in agony. Nero, unfazed, calmly told the horrified guests it was simply an epileptic fit. Within minutes, the boy was dead. Dinner continued as if nothing had happened. For a few years, Nero's darker instincts were held in check by three figures: his mother Agrippina, Seneca, and the Praetorian prefect Sporus. This trio, known as his good counselors, kept the empire steady, ushering in a brief period of stability. But Agrippina had not clawed her way to power just to share it. She demanded influence over every decision, appeared beside Nero in ceremonies, and even wanted her face struck on Roman coins. Nero, still a teenager, longed for freedom, not the burdens of rule, but the pleasures of power. Racing chariots, performing on stage and chasing lovers. His mother scorned him for it. The final break came when Nero fell for Poppaea Sabina, young, ambitious, and manipulative. She whispered in his ear that he was no emperor at all, while his mother pulled the strings. Sensing the threat, Agrippina began backing Britannicus, hinting she may have chosen the wrong son to rule. It was her fatal mistake. Nero resolved to kill her. But Agrippina was no easy target. She was beloved by the people, guarded by soldiers, and protected herself with food tasters and antidotes. Poison was useless, so Nero turned to engineering. He had a special boat built, its roof rigged to collapse at sea and crush her inside, disguising murder as an accident. On March 23, 59 AD, Agrippina joined her son at a festival in Baiae. In high spirits, she boarded the vessel for the return trip, unaware it was a floating death trap. At sea, the mechanism triggered. The roof caved in with a deafening crack. But fortune twisted. Instead of killing Agrippina, it crushed her companion. Agrippina, ever a survivor, hurled herself into the dark waters. Weighted down by heavy robes, she swam desperately as sailors struck at her with poles and oars. Against all odds, she reached the shore alive, her escape a temporary reprieve from her son's murderous designs. Somehow, Agrippina reached the shore. This was the same woman who had endured exile under Caligula, survived the paranoia of Claudius, and now escaped the death trap set by her own son. But her luck was running out. When word reached Nero that his mother still lived, he panicked. The pretense of an accident was gone. Agrippina knew exactly who had tried to kill her. If she rallied her allies, his throne could vanish overnight. Nero turned to Anicetus, the admiral who had engineered the fatal ship. The order was short and cold. Finish it. That night, soldiers stormed Agrippina's villa. They found her soaked from the sea, desperately trying to send messages to her supporters. When the armed men broke into her chamber, she stood firm. Facing her killers, she raised her voice. "Strike my womb first. Stab the body that gave birth to such a monster." The soldiers hesitated. This was the daughter of Germanicus, the sister of Caligula, the mother of their emperor. But duty won over loyalty. Their blades fell again and again, until Agrippina lay dead in her own blood. When news reached Nero, his relief drowned out any shame. The woman who had raised him to power and tried to control him was gone. But the Romans saw more than politics. A son who murdered his mother had crossed into the unthinkable, an act that desecrated the sacred heart of Roman society. Rumors swirled through the city. Some whispered that Nero gazed upon his mother's corpse, mocking her body and commenting on her features. Whether truth or slander, the image stuck. Nero had become something less than human. With Agrippina gone, nothing restrained him. Seneca and Burrus, the good influences, soon faded. By the early 60s, both were dead or sidelined. Alone at the center of power, Nero indulged himself without limit. He raced chariots like a common athlete, performed songs before captive audiences, and filled the palace with endless excess. But his marriage to Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, grew unbearable. She was dutiful, modest, and beloved by the people, everything Nero despised. His heart belonged to Poppaea Sabina, ambitious and seductive, who urged him to rid himself of his wife. At first, Nero tried divorce, claiming incest had invalidated the union. When that excuse failed, he accused Octavia of adultery, forcing false confessions through torture. Rome didn't believe a word of it. Riots erupted. Statues of Poppaea were toppled and dragged through the streets, while Octavia's image was crowned with flowers. For a brief moment, Nero wavered. The people's love for Octavia reminded him that not even emperors could ignore Rome forever. But history shows what choice he made. The riots forced Nero to remember a dangerous truth. Even emperors ruled only as long as the people allowed it. He briefly recalled Octavia to the palace, pushing Poppaea aside. But Poppaea was not a woman who accepted second place. She convinced Nero that the protests were proof of conspiracy, that Octavia still had loyalists plotting against him. It did not take much persuasion. Octavia was arrested and exiled to the barren island of Pandateria, where generations of disgraced imperial women had wasted away. Yet exile was not enough. Within days, Nero sent the order for her execution. She was only 20 years old when soldiers entered her cell. Bound and helpless, she offered no resistance as they opened her veins. Her short life, manipulated as a pawn in dynastic games, ended quietly, her last words calling to her father Claudius and her murdered brother Britannicus. Her severed head was sent back to Rome as proof. Poppaea received it like a twisted wedding gift. Just days later, Nero and Poppaea were married in a spectacle dripping with wealth. The halls glittered with gold, the wine poured endlessly, and the emperor himself performed songs he had composed. Rome now had a new empress, one who had ascended over the corpses of all who stood in her path. But Nero's hunger went beyond blood. He wanted a stage large enough for his ambition. That stage would be Rome itself. On July 18th, 64 AD, fire broke out near the Circus Maximus. In the dry summer heat, flames leapt across wooden rooftops, and the inferno raged for 6 days. Narrow streets became death traps, smoke and falling beams killing thousands. The lucky escaped to open fields and gardens. The rest perished, their cries lost in the roar of collapsing buildings. Ancient accounts differ. Some say Nero was away in Antium and returned in haste. Others claim he organized relief efforts. But the story that echoed across history was darker, that as the city burned, Nero stood high above the flames and sang of Troy's destruction, treating catastrophe as performance. Whether literal or not, the image was damning, an emperor finding inspiration in his people's misery. When the fire finally died, 10 of Rome's 14 districts lay in ruins. Hundreds of thousands were homeless, the dead uncountable. Yet for Nero, this was not tragedy but opportunity. Among the smoldering ashes, he envisioned a new Rome, a city crowned by his masterpiece, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It would sprawl across 300 acres from Palatine to Esquiline, swallowing entire neighborhoods. Not a palace for a ruler, but a monument to a man who believed himself greater than Rome itself. The centerpiece of Nero's Golden House was a rotating banquet hall that turned endlessly, as if the emperor dined among the stars themselves. Gold leaf, ivory, and precious stones covered every surface, while artificial lakes swallowed the ruins of once lively neighborhoods. At its heart stood a colossal bronze statue of Nero, towering over Rome like a god made flesh. But the true obscenity was not the luxury, it was the timing. Even as smoke still lingered over the ruins and bodies were dragged from the ashes, construction crews were already clearing the wreckage. Families who had lost everything watched as their former homes were paved over for gardens and fountains to amuse the emperor. The whispers spread quickly. The fire had not been an accident. Nero had wanted Rome to burn so he could rebuild it in his own image. And when the people began to murmur too loudly, the emperor searched for someone to blame. He found the perfect scapegoat in a strange sect from the east, the Christians. They were already viewed with suspicion, worshipping a crucified criminal and speaking of an apocalypse in flames. To many Romans, they seemed alien, even dangerous. Nero exploited this fear, unleashing a wave of persecution that shocked even the brutal standards of the empire. He did not simply execute them, he turned their deaths into theater. In his private gardens, Christians were covered in pitch, tied to stakes, and set alight as living torches to illuminate his feasts. Their screams mingled with Nero's poetry as he recited verses before delighted guests. Others were sewn into animal hides and thrown to hunting dogs, or crucified in grotesque displays styled after myths. The emperor himself often arranged the scenes, fussing over details like a stage director perfecting a performance.
But even these horrors did not quench his appetite for destruction. By 65 AD, Nero committed a crime that stunned even those who thought him beyond redemption. The murder of his own wife, Poppaea. She was pregnant with his child, a daughter they named Claudia Augusta. For a fleeting moment, fatherhood seemed to soften him. He celebrated her birth with festivals and public holidays across the empire. Yet the same hands that built palaces and orchestrated spectacles would soon destroy them both. Claudia Augusta, Nero's infant daughter, lived only 4 months before an illness carried her away. The loss unhinged the emperor, and soon after, it was Poppaea herself who paid the price. Ancient writers disagree on the details, but the outcome is always the same. She was pregnant, and Nero was the cause of her death. One account paints the most brutal picture. During a heated quarrel over his obsession with chariot racing, the empress confronted him, perhaps tired of playing second to his stables, perhaps realizing too late that the monster she had encouraged could never be controlled. The shouting echoed through the palace, until Nero, consumed by fury, lashed out. His foot struck her swollen belly. Poppaea crumpled to the marble floor, clutching her abdomen as blood spilled down her legs. Her unborn child died instantly, and within moments, so did she. The emperor watched in silence, his expression cold, almost bored, as if her suffering was nothing more than an inconvenience. When it was done, he ordered slaves to remove the body and went back to planning the next games. With Poppaea gone, Nero lost more than a wife. He lost his partner in ambition, the one person who had matched his hunger for cruelty. In her absence, he grew restless, consumed by a need to recreate what he had destroyed. That was when his gaze fell on a young slave named Sporus. Barely a teenager, the boy carried an eerie resemblance to the dead empress. Fair hair, delicate features, and a quiet grace that stirred something twisted in Nero's mind. The emperor's grief warped into obsession. He devised a plan so grotesque, it shocked even Rome's most jaded elites. Sporus would not merely replace Poppaea, he would become her. The young slave had no idea what awaited him. Summoned before the emperor, he likely thought he'd be given a simple duty. Instead, Nero announced something unthinkable. Sporus would be castrated. Imperial physicians carried out the command, silencing their oaths as healers. The boy's screams echoed through the palace as his future was stolen from him. Nero wanted him frozen in the image of Poppaea, never to become a man. But mutilation was only the beginning. Sporus was dressed in women's garments, taught to move, speak, and gesture like an empress. Once his transformation was complete, Nero staged a mock wedding. The boy, veiled and perfumed, stood before Rome's elites while contracts were signed and rituals observed. The court watched in stunned silence, too terrified to protest. From then on, Nero called him "my wife," parading him through the city in a gilded litter. Behind closed doors, Sporus's life was even darker. Forced to play the role of Nero's dead wife, he endured constant abuse. With no allies, no family, no way out, he existed only as a living prop in the emperor's perverse fantasies. But Nero's cruelty wasn't confined to the palace. He forced senators and knights into degrading spectacles, some into gladiator fights, others onto the stage. Many chose suicide over submission. Seneca, Nero's old tutor, opened his veins rather than obey another imperial command. At night, Nero disguised himself as a commoner and prowled the streets with his companions, attacking citizens for sport. Shopkeepers beaten, women assaulted, men murdered. Victims who survived were later charged with treason for striking their disguised emperor. Even his banquets became theaters of depravity. Guests were pressured to attend nights of excess, filled with drunkenness, cruelty, and staged executions. Nero believed music sounded sweeter when accompanied by real screams of pain, strumming his lyre while prisoners suffered nearby. Word spread quickly. The provinces grew restless. Generals questioned their loyalty, and even the Praetorian Guard began to murmur. Rome's most powerful man was becoming dangerously isolated, blind to the storm gathering around him. Drunk on power and blinded by his own vanity, Nero convinced himself that the empire adored him as much as he adored his own voice. When news of unrest in the provinces reached him, he waved it away as the jealousy of men too simple to grasp his genius.
In 66 AD, he launched what he imagined would be his crowning achievement, a tour of Greece. For an entire year, he paraded across the provinces, singing, racing chariots, acting on stage. At every contest, he miraculously won. Even when thrown from his chariot and failing to finish the race, the judges declared him champion. Few doubted why. Their lives depended on it. By the end, Nero had amassed thousands of victors' crowns, returning to Rome in triumph as though he had conquered nations rather than theaters. But Rome was not impressed. Their emperor had drained the treasury for his artistic victories, while the empire itself began to fracture. In Gaul, rebellion flared. In Spain, Galba marched with an army. Even Africa murmured with unrest. For the first time, Nero faced not an actor's stage but a battlefield, and he was utterly unprepared.
Instead of rallying his soldiers, he dreamed of another tour, this time to Egypt, where he believed audiences would finally appreciate his brilliance. Letters were sent to governors, excusing his absence, promising he would deal with the rebellion later. But rebellion would not wait. In Rome, patience snapped. Senators whispered in corners, the people muttered in the streets, and the Praetorian Guard itself shifted allegiance to Galba. The emperor who had once ruled the world through fear and spectacle now found himself abandoned. The end of Nero, like the man himself, came not with honor but with humiliation. June 8, 68 AD. Nero awoke to silence. The Praetorian Guard, once his iron shield, had deserted him. The Senate branded him an enemy of Rome, condemning him not to an honorable death, but to the lash, a punishment meant for slaves and thieves. For the first time, the emperor stood stripped of power, surrounded by emptiness. Palace halls that once echoed with music and screams were now deserted. His guards gone, his servants vanished. Even his slaves slipped away in the night. The man who had ruled with fear now discovered how quickly fear evaporates when the spell of power is broken. He wept, raged, and clung to the only companion still by his side, Sporus, dressed in silks, forced to play the empress even as Rome itself rejected her emperor. Reports poured in that Galba's troops were closing in. The Senate's sentence was death. Still, Nero refused to face his fate with courage. Instead, he spun desperate fantasies. He would flee to the east to beg protection from the Parthians, Rome's sworn enemies. In his delusion, he pictured himself performing on foreign stages, adored as an artist in exile. But reality was cruel. The flatterers and sycophants who once cheered his every note had melted away. No generals, no allies, not even musicians agreed to follow him. With dawn breaking and time running out, he made his last cowardly choice: escape into hiding. He crept out of Rome, cloaked and hunched like a fugitive. Gone were the gilded litters and jeweled chariots. Now he stumbled through fields in the dark, mud clinging to his sandals. Only 4 remained with him: a freedman named Phaon, his secretary Epaphroditus, his valet Neophytus, and Sporus, still painted, still adorned, still dragged into the emperor's collapsing world. Together they slipped into the countryside, heading for Phaon's villa, just miles from the city. The emperor of the world reduced to a fugitive, begging refuge from a former slave. Here, messengers brought word that sealed his fate. Galba's army had entered Rome. The Senate demanded he be beaten publicly before death. And worse, his own household slaves were looting his treasures, parading his golden statues through the streets. Nero collapsed, sobbing like a child. "They are stealing my things, my instruments, my costumes." The tyrant who had burned his city now wept over baubles. Outside, soldiers closed in. Inside, his companions urged him to end it himself, to choose a Roman death. But Nero had never shown courage. Every killing in his reign had been done by others. Now, dagger in hand, he trembled, unable to strike. "These are an artist's hands," he whined, "not made for violence." Epaphroditus, grim and silent, pressed the blade into his master's hand. The hoofbeats grew louder. Shouts echoed above as soldiers surrounded the villa. Nero panicked, pressed the dagger to his throat, and froze. Only when Epaphroditus drove it deeper did the blade find its mark. Blood poured across the dirt floor as the emperor gurgled his last words: "Qualis artifex perio."
What an artist dies in me. It was the final delusion of a man who had created nothing but suffering, imagining himself a misunderstood genius. When the soldiers broke down the door minutes later, they found not a god, not even a king, but a cowardly corpse in a basement, surrounded by frightened servants and a mutilated boy in women's clothes. Rome erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the streets, tearing down his images, laying flowers at statues of his victims. Across the provinces, bonfires and festivals marked the end of a nightmare. Never had the death of an emperor been greeted with such joy.
The Senate ordered his memory erased. His golden house was buried under new monuments. Even his name was damned, carved away from stone. But history could not forget. His reign showed the world what happens when absolute power is given to a man consumed by vanity and cruelty. Nero dreamed of being remembered as an artist. Instead, he became a warning, proof that unchecked power corrupts absolutely, and that even emperors can die like rats in the dark. But here's the truth: history is not just about the past. It's about us. The story of Nero reminds us that cruelty, vanity, and tyranny always collapse in the end. Power without conscience destroys everything, including those who wield it. If you believe these forgotten lessons of history must never be repeated, hit the like button, subscribe to Dark Pages of History, and share this video with others. Together, we'll uncover the darkest corners of the past, so the mistakes of emperors and tyrants are never forgotten. Because the dead can't speak for themselves, but their stories still warn us.